Howdy everyone, and today I'll be reviewing the living daylights out of a pretty unique lens. Here we have the Canon RF 800mm f11 IS STM, which has been recently released only for Canon's mirrorless EOS R system cameras. It will not work on digital SLR cameras at all. By the time you've reviewed over 400 camera lenses on YouTube, when something unusual is introduced to the market, you tend to get a little excited, and I've had a blast testing out this particularly crazy yet enjoyable super telephoto lens, which has a smaller 600mm sibling, which came out at the same time but costs less. A review of that 600mm lens will come a little later. So, 800mm and f11, who would want a lens like this? Well, just the opportunity to reach such an extreme focal length of 800mm is interesting enough for a start, particularly to wildlife photographers and astrophotographers, and 800mm really is pretty crazy. That's a tiny field of view. But anyone already familiar with the annoying nature of shooting with any lens over 500mm or so will be able to see immediately the appeal of this particular new design. This 800mm lens might be big in absolute terms, but compared to other 800mm and extreme telephoto lenses, it's remarkably small and light. So much so that carrying it around with you and hand holding it is no problem at all, which really is a bit of a miracle for a lens of this incredible telephoto reach. I have tested two other 800mm lenses before. The first was a mirror lens, which was just a living nightmare in every way. Build quality, handling and image quality were all dreadful, although funnily enough, it did actually let in twice as much light as this new Canon option, but honestly, please don't consider buying that manual focus mirror lens. The other was the Sigma 300 to 800mm f5.6, occasionally known by its nickname, the Sig Monster. I got some quite nice results with that lens, but trying to lug it around with me to shoot with was just as much of a nightmare as trying to focus that mirror lens. Aside from the Sigma's huge size and lack of image stabilization, it weighed almost 6 kilograms, and its carry case took up most of the boot in my car. Canon's other conventional 800mm L lens isn't much better, being about as big and weighing nearly 5 kilograms. Which leads us nicely onto Exhibit A, as you can see here. This is a conventional 800mm lens that is realistically portable and hand-holdable. Canon have achieved this in three ways. Firstly, by having a diffractive optical element inside. Secondly, by making the lens collapsible, an easy design option considering the space you normally get between glass elements inside a long telephoto lens. And finally, by limiting the lens's aperture to f11. How much of an issue is that? f11 is obviously a very dark aperture, but when shooting outdoors, actually, it's still pretty usable, particularly if you're happy to shoot at higher ISO levels, which your nice, modern Canon EOS R camera will have no problem in doing. Bear in mind that this lens also has an excellent image stabilizer built in, which is a big relief, as even the best in-camera image stabilization would have a lot of trouble with an 800mm focal length. Here's some footage with the stabilization turned off and now turned on. As you can see, your image is still waving about a little bit, but considering the extreme focal length the stabilization is working at, it steadies your image impressively well. It's pretty easy to get sharp images with this lens with shutter speeds of only 1/50th or even 1/20th of a second, which is pretty astonishing. So, in all honesty, this lens's dark aperture of f11 wasn't particularly a problem for me in the end, even on a cloudy day, unless you're trying to shoot very late in the evening when it's getting too dark. You should also bear in mind that f11 is a bit too dark for stopping action in sports photography, unless you use ridiculously high ISO levels, majorly sacrificing image quality. As well as being relatively small, the lens only weighs 1.2 kilograms, or under 3 pounds, and considering its size, that makes it feel quite lightweight when you're using it. It really is no problem hand-holding this lens and carrying it around with you all day. The old maxim that the best camera lens to have is the one you have with you is very true. It's no use owning an 800mm lens that you never bother to shoot with, despite it costing you a fortune, because it's ridiculously unwieldy, Another advantage of this lens is that it's excellent for anyone on a budget. The lens is $900 in the US or £980 here in the UK. Now, that might be an annoying regional price difference for those living on this side of the Atlantic, and a lot of money in absolute terms wherever you might live. But for a newly designed 800mm autofocus lens with excellent image stabilization, that's actually great value for money. Well, as long as its image quality is acceptable, of course, and we'll look into that in just a minute. Let's take a slightly deeper look at the lens's build quality first. It's made out of quite good quality plastic with a surface finish that feels alternately smooth and rough on different sections. The lens feels somewhat light and hollow, not heavy. Even that nicely textured front section is actually hard plastic. The lens is definitely not weather sealed, so I would be a bit concerned about dust getting sucked into it over time. The extension mechanism uses a wide ring at the rear that clicks quite positively into place, so extending and collapsing the lens is quick and easy. Then you get switches for autofocus, image stabilization, and even a focus limiter switch. Considering that the lens's minimum focus distance is a huge 6 meters, that hardly seems necessary, but they included it anyway. The plastic focus ring turns fairly smoothly and works reasonably well with the focus motor. Some good news is that the lens doesn't seem to display much in the way of focus breathing, keeping its long focal length whether you happen to be focused near or far away. Let's take a look at the lens's autofocus system. On a Canon EOS R5, I found it worked very well really, functioning pretty quickly, quietly and fairly accurately, not missing my subject very often. The autofocus points are limited to a broadly central region of the image, and that can be annoying if you're tracking something that moves out of the central box. However, the lens also works well with the animal eye autofocus feature on the Canon EOS R5 and R6, giving you another nice advantage. A small tripod mount is built into the bottom of the lens for you, which is helpful when the lens is extended. And next to the focus ring comes a silver-coloured programmable control ring for adjusting your ISO, exposure compensation or other settings, but not aperture, as this lens's aperture is fixed at f11. It works with gentle clicks, although for a price, Canon offer a service to de-click it for you. The lens's filter thread size is a large 95mm wide. It comes with your standard front and rear lens caps, but doesn't come with a hood or a carry case, although those will be available separately. But leaving that aside, overall the lens does work fantastically well, and it is light and comfortable to use. Now onto image quality. This is going to be nice and short, as the Canon EOS R system currently only has one size of camera sensor, full frame, and this lens has only one focal length and aperture, 800mm and f11. So, as Henry VIII said to his 6 wives, I won't keep you long. Let's test it on a 45MP Canon EOS R5. In the middle of the image, we see very good, but not great sharpness, and contrast is slightly on the low side. Bear in mind that the effects of diffraction are setting in already at f11, which would definitely explain why the lens isn't quite razor sharp here. Let's look in the image corners. They're just a little softer, but still pretty good. Overall, I think this lens's image quality is more than satisfactory. Even on a very high resolution camera sensor, it draws out a good deal of detail from whatever you point it at. But as I mentioned, you might want to add a little contrast and sharpness. Now, when it comes to distortion and vignetting, the lens projects some negligible pincushion distortion here, and there's some mild vignetting too, which your in-camera correction should be able to clear up quite nicely. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. Yes, what I said earlier about the lens's minimum focus distance being 6 meters is indeed true. That is a really long way, which means that you won't get any more magnification on your subject than the 600mm lens here. You'll just be able to shoot from a bit further away. Anyway, your close-up images will be just slightly softer than those taken at normal distances. Now, let's see how the lens works against bright lights. That was a slightly tricky thing for me to test actually. Here we can see that the lens shows just a little flash of flaring when a bright light is in or right on the edge of the image, but otherwise contrast is holding up very well indeed. And finally, let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh. At 800mm, you can get some quite strongly autofocus backgrounds despite the very dark aperture of f11, and the good news is that those backgrounds generally look very nice and smooth. I never noticed anything offensive in them, except perhaps a slight jumbling when the background is complex. What can we say then overall? Well, it's amazing to have an autofocus, image stabilized 800mm lens on your camera that's pretty sharp and small and portable and realistically hand-holdable. That makes it unique, and the fact that it's less than $1,000 is the icing on the cake, really. It could open up the world of wildlife, nature and astrophotography for a lot of people. Yes, the lens's aperture is only f11 and that is very dark, but who cares? Canon's EOS R cameras produce very good image quality at high ISOs, and the image stabilization is very effective too. I'll just mention here again, a review of the 600mm f11 lens is on the way too, as well as a special video about which one you should consider choosing, so keep an eye on this channel. I can't quite give this lens a highly recommended mark because it won't be everyone's cup of tea, and that's totally fine. Not everyone has the same requirements, but I seriously like it. It's better than I thought it would be, and for some people it might be a legitimate reason to even buy into the Canon EOS R system, so it definitely does come recommended.